welcome in Dr. Jomo, who will explain in depth the complexity of Malaysia's economic and chart a course towards a brighter future in a rapidly changing world. Dr. Jomo, please.
Ni men hao. Assalamualaikum. I want to emphasize the importance of peace. Peace is not something you can take for granted anymore in this world. Unfortunately, we are living in very dangerous times, not only economically, but also I think we are living in a world where there are many forces who want war for all kinds of reasons. And this, I think, is a very real danger because the possibility of the outbreak of war is very serious. And this is something which we should take into consideration when we're thinking about the economy. But let me first thank the Kuala Lumpur and Selangor Chinese Assembly Hall for the kind invitation to join you today. This is your 100th anniversary. And so this morning I went to the Chinese Assembly Hall. And I actually panicked because there was nobody there. But anyway, thankfully there are still a few taxis driving around. Grab has not monopolized everything. And so I was able to get here in time. But I think it's very important for us to think about our situation historically also. Kuala Lumpur and Selangor were a very different place a century ago. And it's important for us to recognize how the nature of the economy in which we live. Most importantly, I want to focus, I had a very long presentation which I will not impose upon you, but I think it's important for us to recognize that the value of Malaysia, and before that Malaya, was very great to the British Empire. Okay? There are people in this country who say, oh, we were never colonized, etc. That's nonsense. Okay? In the half decade after World War II, Malaya contributed 70% of the foreign exchange earnings of the entire British Empire. Okay? 70% just from one. Part of the reason, of course, was that a lot of India, for example, got independence and so on. But even India by that time was not very significant as far as the empire was concerned. Remember that when India was first colonized, it constituted 1/4 of the world economy. Like China, it constituted 1/4 of the world economy. By the time the British left, India constituted 4% of the world economy. Okay? That is the effect of colonialism. Now, in the case of Malaya, it was a different story. Okay? Malaya was very, very important. And this is part of the reason why we were colonized. This is why many of our ancestors came to this country, were brought to this country, not only from China, not only from India, not only from Sumatra, not only from Java, but many other places as well. So it's important for us to recognize this as we are trying to build a new society in this country. Now, this period of growth depended on what was called an open economy. The open economy, not an open economy of choice, but an open economy imposed by colonialism. Okay, so we were valuable precisely because we were exporting a lot of products which are of value to the rest of the world. Initially, it involved tin. Later, rubber became very important and so on. And of course, I don't need to go into all this. Many of you are more involved in many of these businesses than I am. But that era of increasing trade liberalization has come to an end. Okay? It began to come to an end in the post-war period. And you have to remember that until Kennedy became president in 1961, the US economy was actually a very closed economy. Kennedy, advised by Samuelson, made a deal in order to open up the economy, the US economy. Okay? And so that period of so-called trade liberalization has basically come to an end. Now, in the last part of the 20th century, it incorporated many economies which were not previously part of the world economy dominated by the West. China became part of this. India also opened up. And it's important to recognize these trade transformations which took place. But those trade transformations had consequences. Profits increased for the companies which are producing all over the world, including in East Asia, including in China, including in Malaysia. But together with those profits, we begin to see that the quality of jobs, for example, in the US also deteriorated. So greater reliance on opioids. Okay? These are substances which are opium-like, and companies made a lot of money. A lot of money. Purdue Company, for example, sold a lot of opioids, and this created a huge problem. So by the end of the 20th century, there were beginning to be doubts about the future of globalization. And those doubts have become part of American discourse. The last person who was treading a line was probably Barack Obama as President of the United States. He said, oh, let's have this pivot to Asia. What was a pivot to Asia? Basically, it was to limit China, basically. Okay? So you have a significant change in US attitudes beginning from around the end of the first decade of the 21st century. And so this, together with this, we have to recognize that we have seen the end of the era of trade liberalization. So for those who continue to say, oh, let us continue to have trade liberalization and hoping that somehow other things will magically become better for us, I'm afraid they are living in a make-believe world. The second point I want to make is about the era of so-called quantitative easing has also come to an end. The era of relatively low interest rates in the last decade has come to an end. Now, especially since the beginning of last year, we have seen the US Fed leading the Western world in pushing up interest rates. I say the Western world very deliberately because the country which has resisted this pushing up of the interest rates has actually been Japan. Japan has refused to push up its interest rates. Finally, Governor of the Bank of Japan, Kuroda, was just recently replaced a few months ago by Ueda. And Ueda has already indicated that he will change policy. But let us remember that for many, many decades, Japan has relied on low interest rates to ensure economic growth. Now that period of rapid economic growth came to an end from around 1989, okay? And there are many reasons which we can't get into right now. But the point I want to make right now is that interest rates are going up. Why are interest rates going up? Interest rates are going up because of a faith, of a belief which is not based on any serious economic analysis, but a belief that somehow or other you have to bring down inflation to 2%. And how do you bring down inflation to 2%? You do it by increasing interest rates, because increasing interest rates means that there'll be less investments, there'll be less consumption, because you cannot afford. So that is the basic logic of raising interest rates, to quell consumption, to bring down investments and consumption. Will that bring down inflation? Yes and no. It will suppress consumption. It will suppress investments. But look at the sources of inflation which we face in the world today. What are the main sources of inflation? The number one source is the supply side disruptions. Supply side disruptions which we have seen since the beginning of the Second Cold War, from the time of Barack Obama, increased by Donald Trump and continued by Joe Biden. Okay, so we have now a world of where international antagonisms are considered to be legitimate, you know, and countries have been forced to take sides in this new emerging Cold War. And more countries are saying no, are refusing to, especially the bigger developing countries, the so-called BRICS and so on. They have made very clear that they're not going to simply follow one side or the other. But the smaller countries are also beginning to assert themselves. And the smaller countries are also beginning to say no, okay, in many different ways, which I won't get into right now. But the point is that US increasing interest rates forces everybody else to raise interest rates. So when some of you complain about, oh, the ringgit is getting very weak, why is it getting very weak? Because since the beginning of this year, thankfully, Bank Negara, the Monetary Policy Committee, has refused to raise interest rates, okay? And by not raising interest rates, it has kept down the cost of borrowing for people who want to get involved in investment, as well as consumption. But this means that the ringgit has declined in value, okay? So these are very difficult choices one has to make in this world in which we live. And it's precisely because these are very difficult choices that it is important for people to understand why these choices are being posed and what are the implications thereof. I'm sure that many of you, for example, who are supporting children studying abroad and so on and so forth, who are complaining because the ringgit is now lower in value. But at the same time, there are many people who would not be able to afford higher interest rates. This is a difficult choice. There's no choice. And there's no so look at what has happened. Inflation came down this year in Malaysia without raising interest rates. Okay? Why? Because the supply side disruptions were more or less stabilized. Higher oil prices, etc. All those things were more or less stabilized. So it's important to understand why this is the case. Okay? So this US Fed policy is, the US right now has close to full employment. Singapore has close to full employment. Very few other economies in the world have close to full employment. We are not bad. We are actually quite close to full employment when you consider there are probably 6 to 7 million foreign workers working in this country. We are not very far from full employment. But the point is that you have a situation right now where the rest of the world does not have full employment. And this is going to mean declining conditions for a lot of people. And let us not forget that Malaysia, that since before the pandemic, Malaysia, like all other Southeast Asian countries, the #1 trading partner is no longer the West, not the Western countries. The #1 trading partner is China. So what are the implications? You go and join into in the suffocation of China for what? Okay? And so Southeast Asian countries are all, even Singapore, Lee Hsien Loong, who used to be quite pro-Western, even he has to rethink his options in this situation. So I think it's important for us to begin to recognize how this world is changing and is likely to continue to change in very important ways. So the combination of the end of trade liberalization plus rising interest rates plus increasing hostilities are basically causing the possibility of stagnation. And because in some countries inflation continues to rise, people talk about stagflation, a combination of economic contraction together with inflation. Now, let me quickly just emphasize to you why I consider the danger in the world, the danger of war, to be extremely serious. Okay? If you look at what happened in Russia, okay, between 1992 and 1994, when Boris Yeltsin was the president of Russia. What did he do? He introduced economic policies mainly devised by people from the United States, but also elsewhere in the West, introduced those policies, and the result of it was within 3 years, 92 to 94, the economy of Russia halved. Okay? Life expectancy in Russia for males fell by 6 years. In the last 6,000 years of recorded human history, it has never happened before. Okay? So you can understand why they cheated to get Boris Yeltsin elected for the first time. There's even a Hollywood film about the cheating which was involved to sell Boris Yeltsin. Many people believe that actually Juganov, who was the main opposition candidate, actually won the elections. But he was basically threatened with assassination, and he dare not go and insist. So we are now living in a situation where you have the former superpower, Russia, collapsing by half, taking another 22 years to get back to the same size as previously. They can't spend very much on military, so what do they have? They have the arsenal, the military arsenal, the equipment from before the end of the Cold War. And what was there? That was basically nuclear. Nuclear, okay? It was part of a world which the younger people here will not know, a world called MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. That was the world in which we lived in those days. They were even talking about fighting in outer space, okay? So-called Star Wars. Some of you who are old enough, you might remember Reagan's proposal of Star Wars. Okay? We are talking about literally creating weapons for fighting in outer space. That is the world in which we live. So now we have a situation where a person like Putin, okay, who basically took over peacefully from Yeltsin, he was Yeltsin's appointed successor, suddenly finds himself to be the enemy of the West. Some of you who are old enough will remember George W. Bush, the younger one, said, "I have looked into the eyes of Putin and I saw the shadow of God." No, seriously, he said that, okay? Because what he was saying was, this is a man you could trust, okay? And during the Bush years, there was no increase in antagonism until the final year, until they couldn't find any more enemies in Western Asia, in the Arab world. Okay, remember the war on terror? That was when Mr. Wolfowitz came up with his new strategy for American security. And this is basically what happened. So let me quickly move on to underscore that when you have very, very limited weapons, when you need to go and buy drones from Iran, when you need to go and seek, what's his name? I can't remember which Kim this one is. Yeah, Kim Jong-un. Okay, you need to go to him to buy your weapons. You really are in a fairly desperate situation. Okay, so what do? You don't have very much. Okay. So I would say that the threat is a real threat, because you are going to do something which the Soviet Union did to US in the early 1960s. Okay, they moved missiles to Cuba. Okay, they moved missiles to Cuba, and Kennedy said no way. Okay. But fortunately, Kennedy was willing to talk. And he contacted Khrushchev and he said, no way, you get out your missiles out. And the missiles were removed, and that was the end of that threat. Now, that same scenario has been flipped over, where the US is saying, we are going to move NATO right to your border, right to Ukraine. Okay? And we have already seen the experiences of this. Remember the MH flight, which was shot down? That was partly the consequence of this kind of situation. So this is not something theoretical, it's something which is very, very real. So we have to think very seriously about this. And that's why I think what the policies which were decided in the 1950s and 1960s are now more relevant than ever, but in a new way. Okay? When you think about the 1950s, okay? Bandung Conference. Bandung Conference was basically a conference of non-alignment for Africa and Asia, the newly decolonized countries. 1961, the non-aligned movement was officially launched with leaders mainly from developing countries, but also including Tito, who was the leader of Yugoslavia, who had dissented with Stalin. Okay, this is what 1961 was about. And in 1967, for example, when when ASEAN was created, after that, there was a commitment to something called ZOPFAN, the Zone of Peace, Freedom, and Neutrality, which is what Southeast Asia is supposed to be. But have we really stuck to that? We are providing military facilities to countries. We are allowing the Straits of Malacca to be used for nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed and nuclear-powered vessels, and so on and so forth. We have to be very serious about this. Okay? Now, China is not helping. If China doesn't only selectively abides by international law and does not recognize the law of the sea, then it's not helping. We need to resolve, and this is where, in a way, it's easier to deal with China because China is willing to negotiate, and there has to be serious negotiations to resolve these issues. You know? So we need to have non-alignment, but also a pacifist non-alignment, an anti-war non-alignment. This is urgent. This is very urgent for the reasons which I've just tried to describe. So, as far as Malaysia is concerned, what does all this mean? What this means is that we need to be pragmatic. We need to be pragmatic with a new round of so-called industrial policies, or what I would call investment and technology policies. Okay? Now suddenly the West has rediscovered these things. These were said to be bad policies. But now the West has rediscovered it. Look at Inflation Reduction Act of Joe Biden. Look at what Mariana Mazzucato is proposed for the European Commission. All these are actual policies which are being adopted by the West, who once upon a time tried to kill UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. Okay. So now these policies are acceptable, and we have to be pragmatic. But you cannot be pragmatic when you have a situation where policies are being made due to all kinds of political compromises. You know, my colleague Mushtaq Khan and I wrote about these things, about what he calls political settlements. Okay? Political compromises which are bad compromises, which do not help development. And so the other thing I would say is that it's important for us to promote domestic investments. If you look at the evidence throughout the world, domestic investments lead, foreign investments follow. Here, for the last 7 decades, we have been practicing exactly the opposite. Foreign investment leads, domestic investment is supposed to follow. Has that actually happened in the world? No. We have to privilege domestic investments. And now with all the silly laws we have, international agreements we have agreed to, we have a situation where it does not make sense for a Malaysian investor to be registered in Malaysia. you can get more privileges by being a foreign investor, say, let us say, south of the Causeway, than you can being based in Malaysia. It is not a surprise that the company, which I didn't use this morning, okay, run by Malaysians, is actually registered in Singapore. Okay? So you actually have a situation where we have created all kinds of laws which actually do not help Malaysian investors to develop. And that's why it's important for us to put much more emphasis on domestic direct investment, less on foreign direct investment, and certainly less on foreign portfolio investment. Because foreign portfolio investment is what caused the problem of the Asian financial crisis, including the Malaysian financial crisis 1997, 1998. I won't get into that right now, but for those of you interested, we can talk about it. So ultimately, what we need in this country, in my view, is a progressive role for government. That is extremely urgent. But right now, we have a situation where the role of government is limited by the fact that we have basically given all kinds of tax breaks. All kinds of tax breaks for the last 4 decades. Tax breaks have been given as if somehow or other, believing in this thing, which there's an economist in Chicago named Arthur Laffer. You know, I consider his views rather laughable, but anyway, Arthur Laffer basically says, you know, if you tax people less, they will invest much more. Is there any evidence for this? No, but it doesn't matter. That's a belief you want to have. And this is basically what has happened in this country. People believe that if you tax people less, and it's no surprise that Malaysians are among the biggest property purchase in the UK in the 21st century was by Malaysian. Okay? The longest list of non-Americans, including Latin America, the longest list of investors using, what do you call it, in the Panama Papers, yeah? Mossack Fonseca, okay, exposed in 2016. The longest list was Malaysian, full of Malaysians, okay? So don't be surprised that there is a great deal of leakage. Malaysia is not short of capital. What Malaysia lacks right now is basically the technological capabilities, and this needs to be actively encouraged. So I would suggest that a much more pragmatic and progressive role for government is urgently needed. And unfortunately, we have a situation where over the last half decade or so, we have been moving from one kind of crisis management to another kind of crisis management, which does not lend itself to a progressive role for government. But before that, it was worse. Before that, you had basically a government which was involved in stealing not from you, but from future generations. Because you incurred a great deal of debt which will be taken away for future generations. Let me stop here. I think I've taken a bit more time than I was supposed to. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jomo. Hello, thank you, Dr. Jomo. We have to shorter, we have some time limitation here, so we may have to shorten our lunch break. So I also try to shorten my introductions. The next speaker will be Dr. Terence, and I believe he's a very hardworking scholar. Why? Because this morning he only WhatsApped to me his slide, and at about 7 a.m., then at 8 a.m. he edited again. So it spent me quite a lot of time to study his very complex, like firewall kind of picture. So later on you can see that kind of picture.
Is this on? Thank you for exposing all my deep secrets. I'd like to thank the KLS Chinese Assembly Hall for inviting me to speak, because it is a fact that very few people know anything about government-linked companies. And this is an important topic because it's such a central feature of the Malaysian political as well as its economic system. Can we go to the next slide, please? I'm going to focus my discussion today, because I have only 20 minutes, on the review of the 12th Malaysia Plan. And I want to situate the GLCs in the discussion in the 12th Malaysia Plan. First, let me commend the government on the 12th Malaysia, on the review, because this is an interesting plan. It was created by Muhyiddin with SPV, it was introduced by Ismail Sabri, and now Anwar Ibrahim has taken charge of the midterm review. This is the first time we are seeing the hand of 3 different prime ministers in a Malaysia plan. But let's focus on what the government did, the Anwar government did when they came in. And it's commendable. If you read the 12th Malaysia Plan, it's actually commendable what they have done in a period of just about 7-8 months. But here are the goals, and look at the goals. The goals are no one left behind, and the outcome, equal access to opportunity, regardless of ethnicity. And I also kept the word location. Here this is all from the review. I also kept the point on location, the spatial dimension. Where is poverty located? The second point for today's discussion, how do we boost entrepreneurship? And specifically, and I like to speak on this too, the small and medium scale enterprises. I'm glad that the opening speech by Mr. Nyang stressed this on SMEs, and I was very happy to see that Wu Wing Tai devoted his attention to SMEs. They're an important discussion here. But how do we lift the SMEs? And here, creating conducive and holistic entrepreneurial ecosystem. Grand words. And this is what we have to look to. How are they going to implement it? And finally, and this is so important, improving the public delivery system. You can have the best policies in the country, but if you do not have an efficient public delivery system, nothing is going to work. The next slide, please. Now, I've tried to capture here in this, it's very complex. It's a very busy slide, but here what I'm trying to do is, I'm trying to capture 50, 60 years of history in this one slide. All the speakers who came before me spoke about history and important progressive policies in the past. And if you look at this here too, if you look at the period just before independence and the post-independence period, right up to 1980, in fact, the government was highly interventionist. And one key policy to redress social inequities created by the British colonial government, this was what the NAP was for. It was a progressive policy. How did they go about doing it? They created what was known as public enterprises. And the public enterprises intervened actively in the economy. I was asked to speak on government-business relationships, different types of state-business relations. This was the first time. The government now creating public enterprises, later called GLCs, and then intervening the economy to rectify social injustices. And did they do a good job? Yes, they in fact did a good job. If you look at the poverty rates in this country, it was reduced appreciably. If you look at rural development, they did a good job in terms of rural development. Felda was a great success, taking landless poor and making them a landed middle class. They're important success stories from government intervention. But the next defining moment was 1981, when Mahathir came in and Mahathir changed the whole thing. Let me rephrase that. Mahathir changed part of the system. He kept the interventionist part, but he also took up the discussion of a new economic system, neoliberalism, talking about corporatization and privatization. There's not been much literature on corporatization. There's been a lot of discussion on privatization. But I want to talk about corporatization. The public enterprises, many of them are corporatized. He tried to privatize them by listing them on the stock market. He was not very successful with some of them. Felkra, for example. He was more successful, or rather Najib was more successful with Felda, and you saw the consequences of that. But the point here is this. The ultimate aim of both the first model of government-business relations and the second model under Mahathir, where he shifted from institutions to individuals. He wanted to create Malay corporate captains. This was a significant shift. Now, the BCIC policy becomes relevant, the Bumiputra Commercial and Industrial Community. The shift to creating privately owned conglomerates with a huge presence in the economy. And the outcome of that, as we saw, Wu Wing-tai spoke about it, Jomo mentioned it, the Asian financial crisis. The way he went about doing it, basically using the stock market as the method to develop these enterprises, failed. And then came a new system. Renationalize everything. And Abdullah came in and he converted what we call public enterprises, and he called them GLCs, government-linked companies. The government became a major player in the economy. They controlled some of the largest publicly listed companies in this country. Today, after the Asian financial crisis, the involvement of the government in the corporate sector, in the general economy, was huge. But as Wu Wing-tai reminded us also this morning, don't forget the bank consolidation exercise. Not only do they have this government GLC ecosystem, they also consolidated the banking system, which resulted in basically the demise of the smaller banks. And the implications of this, especially on the small and medium-scale enterprises, he talked about it. I have some differing views on it, but that's an important epochal moment. Two important events. Who controls the banks now? And what is the extent of the government's involvement in the economy through this huge GLC system? When Abdullah and Najib too, when they came to power, let me speak about Najib, it's more important. Why? Because Najib had a whole slew of new plans. The government transformation plan, the new economic model, nothing new there, but he talked about a new economic model, the ETP, the NKR raise. Every day you open the papers, there's something new that he had on the agenda. One of the key things he said, and this was at the time of the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009. He said, no more affirmative action. He talked about, again, a major public policy that was shaping the way in which the corporate sector was evolving, the way the economy was evolving, the way in which even the GLC ecosystem was being used. And he called for reforms. Very soon he backtracked. He backtracked very quickly. And the consequences of his backtracking, one of the major reasons for doing so was because he recognized that as Prime Minister and as Finance Minister, he controlled a huge segment of the corporate sector. Why give up my control over this huge volume of corporate assets? And because there were no checks and balances in the government, the consequence of that was grand-scale corruption, grand corruption, 1 MDB. And for the first time in Malaysian history, while we had grand corruption for much of the 1980s, we, for the first time in Malaysian history, had a kleptocrat. The term kleptocracy came into play. And then we come now to 2018. This is very important, the 2018 general election. The 2018 general election is very significant because it was the fall, for the first time in Malaysian history, of a single dominant party. This was our chance now for reforms. And there was a lot of discussion on reforms. And there were a lot of attempts to introduce these reforms. The question is, and this is what I want to get into, let's look at the reforms. Can we go to the next page, please? What were the outcomes? This is where we are today. I gave you all the history so that I can show you where we are. Different forms of government business relations. What were the outcomes of these relations? Rents created and abused. Ethnic bypass, selective patronage. Ethnic bypass means targeted at one ethnic community, bypassing another ethnic community, which is extremely entrepreneurial. High wastage of public funds, grand corruption, and GLC capture, the focus of our discussion today. And if you look at the bottom, what is this GLC? What they call GLC actually means many things. The ministries, the federal and state governments control ministries which have control over a huge segment of different types of enterprises. What are they? The GLICs, the government-linked investment companies like MOF Inc., Khazanah, LTAT, which owns Affin Bank, which owns this building, PNB. Then we have the statutory bodies, MARA, MIDA, Petronas. They're all different things. Some are statutory bodies. Statutory bodies mean They were created by law. There's a law governing that one institution, as opposed to the last one, unlisted companies. The multitude of companies, unlisted companies, which fall under the Companies Act, which is a catch-all. The CCM, the Companies Commission of Malaysia, has no clue what's a GLC and what's a privately owned firm. How are they going to make a distinction between what belongs to the government and what belongs to private individuals? Let's go to the next slide. But here is the real issue. This is what it's all about, the elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about, including in the review of the 12th Malaysia Plan. At one point in all the Malaysia plans, especially after 1970, they talked about equity distribution, redistribution, because it was inequitable. Look at the figures. Look at Bumiputra individuals in 1969, I marked it in red. Look at where they were, an outcome of colonial rule. Look at the figures also for the non-Bumiputras. But look also at the figures for foreign firms. And let's fast forward to 1990, that epochal moment when you were supposed to end the NEP and equal access of opportunity to all was supposed to then come into play. They had made significant gains. An increase of about 18 percentage points in 20 years, that's significant. And even then, not many people believe that figure of 19%. They think it is far more than that. Look at the figures for non-Bumiputras. Look at the figures for the Chinese, 45.5%. And who is to say that the NEP was so bad that the Chinese or the non-Bumiputras were left behind? The figures don't say that. In fact, the figures indicate that they also moved up. It could have been better. I'm not saying it was good. It could have been better with more transparency. But that is the figure for 1990. They should have ended the policy then. And look at the figures for foreign firms. It had fallen from 62%, 63% to 25%, a near 40 percentage point decrease. And we are saying that NEP was not a success. But it needed revisions. It needed to be revised. We all knew that. There had to be a change. But the change in the policies didn't occur the way we expected. And if you look then, and they continued it in different forms, and look at where we are now, 2018. I looked at the midterm review to try and find what were the figures in the midterm review. They didn't have it. Except if you see in my notes, the midterm review in one page says, by 2025, they are going to increase it to 30%. I was completely taken aback by this figure. How are they going to achieve the 30% figure in 2 years? Rather ambitious, I must say. But first of all, can you please give us the figures, the most updated figures, so that we know better whether it's achievable or not? I don't think it's achievable because of the problems we've had over the past few years, including the COVID pandemic. Can we go to the next page, please? Just before that, go back, please. I just want to make one point. Look at the last column. Everyone is falling behind. Every ethnic group is falling behind. Who is on the ascendancy? The foreign firms. They're up to 44, 45%. We are going back to the 1970 figures. So that's where we are now, and this is what we have to address. These are the issues we have to look at very carefully in the 12th Malaysia Plan. Can we go to the next one? How do we do it? And I come back to the GLC ecosystem. Now, this is an updated version. You can read. We did a book called Minister of Finance Incorporated where we dealt with this. This is an updated version where I wanted to focus just on a few primary ministries. MOF, Prime Minister's Department, Ministry of Rural Development, and Ministry of Defense. I didn't know when I put in Ministry of Defense, I was going to be speaking at the Affin Bank building, but I'm glad it is. Because we have to talk about Boston. Ministry of Defense. After all, we are talking about corruption. We are talking about government business. And I say we, I'm talking about the government. The government has been talking about corruption. We are going to curb corruption. But the center of this corruption is this. This is where it's situated. And you know now the recent crisis that we had with Boston and Boston selling off, Boston plantations being sold off to KLK, creating another controversy there. I won't get into that, but here I just want to focus on this. In this mapping, we are showing you the different types of institutions that exist in the GLC ecosystem. Statutory bodies, the GLICs, the foundations, holding companies, the DFIs, development financial institutions like Agro Bank, SME Bank, we discussed that this morning, the GLCs, the publicly listed GLCs, and then the unlisted companies. The unlisted companies are those in purple. The multitude of companies which are under the Companies Act, which nobody knows anything about. Nobody wants to talk about this. Najib came to power, said we must look at this is bringing down the economy, let's do something about it, and quickly backtracked. Mahathir comes to power in 2018, and in 2018, before, when he ran to become Prime Minister, he said, this is a monster. He knows. He created it. He created it. But when he came to power, he realized, why do I want to dismantle something which I can use to consolidate my power base? And where is this power base going to come from? How is he going to consolidate it? The Ministry of Rural Development. Of course, take charge of Ministry of Finance, and then he created another ministry called Ministry of Economic Affairs and channeled much of those assets there to Ministry of Economic Affairs under Azmin, his ally, then ally. Ministry of Rural Development. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now, I want to make this point because, why am I focusing on rural development? Because I want to talk about rural poverty. I'm glad Muhammad Khalid is speaking next, because that's something we need to look at. But I'm focusing on Ministry of Rural Development. The Ministry of Rural Development was created by Tun Razak to deal with hardcore poverty in rural areas. It worked. For a long while, under the Ministry of Rural Development, we had institutions such as Khazanah and Khazanah. These are institutions, statutory bodies located in the Malay heartland states, the poor areas, to help bring about, alleviate poverty and bring about development of rural industries. Of course, politically also, that's UMNO's heartland. If you build this base, you get a lot, you consolidate your power. It worked, mutually beneficial. Who is the Minister of Rural Development today? Zahid. Who is the Minister of Defense? Mat Hassan, UMNO. Who is the Prime Minister? Who is the Finance Minister? Now, we thought in 2018, finally, the Prime Minister will no longer be the Finance Minister. Something which Mahathir did also. He did that. And Abdullah carried on, Najib carried on. Why? Why should the Prime Minister want to give up control of the Finance Ministry, which is, as you just saw, so huge? Finally, it was done. Today, we are back to the position of the Prime Minister holding the Ministry of Finance. And another important portfolio, Ministry of Rural Development, where the political struggle is in rural areas, is under UMNO. And as you know, when there's a power play, and the power elites are divided and they want people to jump over, if I can't give you an appointment in the cabinet, what do I give you? A GLC appointment. We didn't spoke about it openly. I don't have the figures here. I took it out because I didn't want to bore you with all the names. 70 over names. Politicians were appointed as chairman. Just the chairmanship is enough. The chairman will discuss with the Minister of Finance or the Prime Minister or Minister of Defense. 2 men deciding everything. Enough. And you have enormous control over the corporate economy and in different sectors of the economy. I'm putting this on the table today because if the government is talking about reforms and devolution of power and wants to eradicate corruption, dismantle this. And when I say dismantle this, I'm saying keep the good, the statutory bodies, but get rid and close down all the GLCs which we don't need. But we got to do it carefully. As you saw on the earlier slides, and you can see in these slides, they created a whole slew of companies. Employment is rampant there. A lot of people are employed in these companies. You can't just simply go and close down these companies. What's going to happen to the poor people working in these areas, in these companies? A bad system was created, and to rectify it, You should not rectify it in a way where you do harm to innocent people who did not do anything wrong, who probably don't even know about the system. We have a monumental task on our hands to do it right, to rectify this wrong. Next slide, please. So remember this, let me stress this. I only showed you Ministry of Rural Development. Look at the Ministry of Agriculture. The key appointments that were made were in Ministry of Agriculture and Ministry of Rural Development. And this brings me now to my last slide. Let me close on this. I want to go back to where I started. I started by showing you what were the goals of the 12th Malaysia, review of the 12th Malaysia Plan. This is a very important document. It's Anwar's first major document telling us where he's going to take us in the next 2 years. So let's go one by one. First, transparent intervention and accountable government-business relations is imperative if we have this system. What have we seen to show us that he's putting into place a proper, transparent, accountable system? For that, we read the 12th Malaysia Plan Review. Here, let's look at policies and strategies. No one left behind. The nature of policies. We have to discuss this. Are policies going to be targeted or universal? Universal means no more race-based policies. It's not an easy issue to discuss. I'm sure even members of this panel will disagree with me, and I agree. We have to talk about it. It's not so simple, either or. Let's look at this carefully. Where is this debate? I hear there's going to be a Bumiputra Economic Congress, but I don't think that should be the way. It shouldn't be exclusive to one ethnic group. The second one, this is very important for today's conference, to boost entrepreneurship. SMEs, the medium and small scale enterprises constitute 98.5% of the corporate sector. We can talk all day long about the GLCs, but the real actor in the corporate sector are the SMEs. About 80% of them are micro firms, meaning 5 employees and less. This is a major structural problem. What are the remedies to help SMEs? And today, nobody talks really about helping SMEs. They talk about the global supply chain. Get them into the global supply chain. When you get into the global supply chain, you can, you're linking up with multinational companies, with the prominent big firms. You can see technology transfer occurring. There's a discussion going on. That's good. Do we have a policy on that? Yes. We have the vendor development program. We have got the global supplier program. This was introduced 20 years ago. What happened to these programs? And they still remain in place, or was there a problem with ethnic bypassing? Is this how we boost entrepreneurship when we leave out a dynamic entrepreneurial base in this country? This is something, again, as I said, we need to have an honest discussion about this. The third point, smart farming, food security. We discussed this earlier. I've already shown you the GLC ecosystem, which is deeply embedded in the rural sectors, in the farming areas, the fishery sector. They can be employed, if employed productively, to deal with this problem, minus the wastage and minus the political patronage. They can be a progressive force for bringing about the important things that need to be addressed in today's economy. Are they doing it? So I did a search on how many times GLCs were mentioned in the midterm review, and they were mentioned twice, 3 times. Is this government also avoiding tackling the GLC issue? Are they not even considering how to use this GLC ecosystem productively, progressively? So the appropriate methods, I've listed them here. Use our statutory bodies. Use them effectively. I'm not talking about the companies. I'm talking about the statutory bodies. Use them effectively. Set out what you're going to do. We have already destroyed the banking sector, the bank consolidation exercise, but we have the DFIs, the Development Financial Institutions. We have the SME Bank. We have Agro Bank. So why can't we use the DFIs in a far more progressive manner too? Or are these DFIs functioning like a commercial bank? With corporatization, I did not mention this, with corporatization, when they took the statutory bodies and made them corporate bodies, they expected them now to make a profit. That's why you're corporatized. Go and do business. Statutory bodies are not supposed to do business. For your information, my university, University of Malaya, is a statutory body. What did we do? We were asked to go and find our own money. They go and set up a holding company, like what most statutory bodies did. We have UM Holdings, and they go in and they try and make money. Is that the role of the university? Is that the role of the statutory bodies? Is it diverting the attention from what they are supposed to do? Which brings me to my point on promoting research and development, commercialization and industrialization, something we talked about this morning too. The investments that are required for R&D is huge. We cannot expect SMEs to put out that kind of very risky investments. There must be enormous support for the government for such investments. They can go bankrupt. Second, there's a talk that SMEs should link up with the GLCs and with the universities. Later today, I hope you will discuss this. There's a forum on education, panel on education. What state are the universities in? I'm really worried about our public universities. The brain drain has been significant. Can they really help promote this R&D working with SMEs? Do the SMEs even trust our universities to work with them? These are important questions. We have to ask. These are structural problems. And finally, on this part, on this segment, the point was raised about China. Jomo raised it. Wu Wing-tai raised it. China looms large in the Malaysian economy. It's mentioned, interestingly enough, hardly mentioned in the midterm review. They talk about the ECRL and they talk about the MCKIP, Industrial Park in Pahang, and they talk about the Kuantan Port. These were things which were started by Najib. But Chinese investments in this country is far more than just that. And some of these investments, especially in the industrial sector, have been quite progressive too. But we have to be careful when these investments come in, because ultimately there's also the importance of developing our domestic firms so that they can stand alone, independent, even in the face of powerful MNCs. And in this case, China, I'm bringing up China because we must discuss this. China uses state-owned enterprises. So now what we have is state-owned enterprises working with GLCs. Look at ECRL. Government-linked companies working with state-owned enterprises. Two powerful institutions, both government-backed, moving into key sectors of the economy. Infrastructure. Public-public partnership. Forget this public-private partnership. It's now public-public partnership. Can this be a progressive force? Yes, with transparency and accountability and openness in the negotiations that are going on. Who are getting the rents? Because when they do implement this, they do have a segment which must go to domestic firms and bring them into the supply chains. Who are the domestic firms which are being brought into these projects too, as part of this project to give out rents or to develop, nurture domestic firms? Which brings me now to the next part, the public governance issue. Here we have policies and strategies. As I said, if you want to do it well, the public governance and the public delivery system is very important. The first thing we have to do is this new institutional architecture. We need a new architecture, institutional architecture, an open, transparent one, where everyone can see it. It's not in the shadow, and we know what it's being used for. Is this government doing it? Or is it just as happy to keep this in the shadow and to use it in the way it has been used in the past? I mentioned the statutory bodies. They can be very useful, but they should not go into business. The devolution of power, I needn't even get into that. We just saw the crisis of the DNAA with Zahid. It clearly brought to light why the Prime Minister cannot have control of the MECC and the AG's office. And don't let me get started on the MECC, because I know how it works too. I've seen it myself now. The Procurement Act, this is so important. The Procurement Act, which the government is discussing today, is highly commendable. We do need a Procurement Act, because the whole system works on creating rents and distributing them through the Procurement Act. The policy which showed us how it can be abused is Jana Vibawa. Jana Vibawa was created to help SMEs during the COVID pandemic. But who got all the contracts, according to the allegations? Through the procurement process, where the procurement process, the system is, they've got very strict regulations, completely bypassed because of the power situated in the office of the Prime Minister. And when Zahid was arrested, he said, why are you arresting only me? Because actually, it's the finance minister who makes the final decisions. That's not true. The cabinet collectively makes the decision. But there you are, a Procurement Act. Now, I'm putting this on the board because if we have a procurement act, it's not just good enough to have a procurement act. The content of the act is important. Does it address the structural problems that we just discussed? Or is it a procurement act for the sake of having a procurement act? We've had similar legislations in the past. Corruption. Corruption is the big issue today. We do need new legislation. We need to talk about things such as cronyism and collusion. We have collusion in the Competition Act, but I'm not talking about that kind of collusion. I'm talking about individuals. Again, the Jana Vibawa case shows the kind of cronyism, collusion, nepotism that occurs. And there's no law really to deal with this. Because what did Muhyiddin say when he was arrested? He said, I broke no law. He didn't say, I didn't do all this. He said, I broke no law. There's no law on this. So the legislation there is, we have to look at MACC carefully. MACC plays a big role here. They have to look at it very carefully. But it does raise questions about issues such as corruption, government business relations of this sort.
Doctor, I may have to stop you.
Yeah, I have to finish. I'll just finish. Finally, the last point, the control mechanisms, the directorships, beneficial ownership. I wanted to close on this point. As you saw in the slides, on the figure on the equity ownership, 12% is with nominee companies. We have no clue, 12%. Beneficial ownership is very important. Who are the beneficial owners? Are they key actors within the state too? So let me close on this point. These are the issues which I hope you will take note of. These are things we need to discuss, and we need to make a representation to the government on how to deal with these issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Terence for his very insightful and comprehensive view and about the ecosystem of the GLC. I call it just like a firewall ecosystem. It's very complex, and I think it takes some time to understand. So I would like to invite our third speaker, Dr. Muhammed Abdul Khalid, on stage to share his insights. So he will do a verbal presentation. Yeah.
How long do I have? 15 minutes. Okay. No, I won't keep it long. First of all, thank you to the Chinese Assembly Hall for the invite. I feel honored. 100-year anniversary, something that you guys should be proud of. I'll try to be as frank as possible, so it make your morning worthwhile. I wanted to comment to some of the points that were raised by Wu Weng Tai and Jomo and Gomez, but maybe I'll do that during Q&A. But just one point on SME. If you read the midterm review of 12th Malaysian Plan, the government do not see higher contribution from SMEs. The original 12th Malaysian Plan expected SMEs to contribute about 45% to the economy. Midterm review revised it downwards to 41%. So the role of SMEs from the 12th Malaysian Plan midterm review is actually much lower. We listened to Jomo about what are the trends moving forward from Gomez. Both I have the honor of being a student, both of them. Now become friends. What's the impact of GLC, global megatrends, trade liberalization on us, on the rakyat? Are we doing better? The answer is no. We are not doing better. We are poorer. The gap between rich and poor, especially among the Chinese, much wider. And moving forward, based on the policies that we have, we would not do much better. And I explained to you why I'm quite pessimistic. I'm an optimistic person, but I'm also a realist. But all is not lost. Group like this is a powerful pressure groups. You can affect change. And I would appeal to you things that perhaps Chinese Assembly can do so that future will be better for all Malaysians. Why do I say we're not doing better? GDP, we heard in Parliament last week, everything but fighting. GDP 6% or 7%, whatever. It's better, higher during Muhyiddin or higher during Anwar. It is pointless, meaningless, if GDP goes up, number of poor people also goes up. And that is what is happening. Between 2019 to now, poverty rate actually increased 6.2%. Or 6.2%, that's not just numbers, there are faces to this, name to this. It's about 500,000 household. One household, 4 people, that's about 2 million Malaysians below poverty line. And if you look, so it's high, it's not yet recovered to pre-crisis. So when you keep hearing GDP better, better, you say, hold on, better for whom? It's not better for that 2 million Malaysians. And if you slice it, Sabah is us. 1 in 5 Sabah live below poverty line, 1 in 5. This is the rate that Malaysia had in 1980s. Sarawak, one of the richest states. The budget of Sarawak every year, or last year, 5 times bigger than Selangor, the budget. Very rich, 10 billion budget. Selangor is 2.4, 2.5. 1 in 10 in Sarawak below poverty line. Poor people keep increasing in Malaysia, not just Sabah and Sarawak. But if you want to be high income, midterm review said we want to be high income. It's not new. Najib also want to be high income, but apparently the only high income person is himself. We should measure poverty. Should be based on high income countries. High income countries, they look at one of the indicator, half of the median income. Now in Malaysia, if your income below about 2,600, you consider poor. Half of median income, about 3,200, about 600 difference. If you use that cutoff, just you increase by 500 ringgit, based on OECD definition, the percentage of poor people in Malaysia will increase from 6.2% to 16%. From 2 million to 5 million. Increasing just by 600 ringgit. That shows how vulnerable many Malaysians are. In other words, if your car get into accident or you need to change a tire, you finish. That's 600 ringgit. Poverty goes up, and a lot of Malaysians are very vulnerable. And if you use this definition, half of median income, I mentioned Sabah, I mentioned Sarawak. KL, poverty rate, based on relative poverty rate, is 12%. Increase 10% in 2019 to 12%. KL. Selangor, I have the number, don't worry, 14%. Penang, 15%. Rich states, poor people. This is a group of business association. You all look very rich, but it's also need to look at our other Malaysians. They are not doing so well. They are here now. I'm not talking about the future. This is here. And poverty rate has not yet reached pre-COVID level. That's my first point. Our policy contributed to this increase of poverty. You bring the crisis. You prolong the crisis, in other words. For instance, we allow, I don't know, I have to choose my words very carefully. I won't say stupid. EPF withdrawal is the biggest mistake this country, our minister, have made since independence. The worst policy ever. Malaysian withdrew 150 billion. Who withdrew? Not all of you. The poor. The savings of B40 dropped by 70%. The savings of T20 went up by 8%. You bring the retirement crisis now. 1 in 2 Malaysians who are about to retire now has only 10,000, which means they only have 200 ringgit to live. Now Malaysians live longer. And if you think that only Bumi are poor, no. The savings of Chinese B40 also low. In fact, the Chinese are much worse because you live the longest. So you suffer longer. But this is also an issue. The last time retirement withdrawal at 55 is okay because we die at 56. So 1 year to jolly lah. Huh? But now we live longer, about 76. Withdrawal still at 55. If you're Chinese woman, in fact, you live almost at OECD level, rich country level, about UK and just 2 years below Denmark, about 80. You Indian male, you live about 69, lower than Bangladeshi average. Wide gap. So retirement crisis now, and we have no children. Chinese below 1, Indian 1.5, Malay is about 2.1. You think Malay have a lot of kids? No, average about 2. So old age poverty is facing us now, and we don't have a lot of children to support. In fact, below 5, children below 5, now compared to 2020, before year 2000, we have about 2.5 million kids below 5 years old. Now we got 2.4 million kids. We are short by 100,000 kids already, and it would continue. So we have old age poverty. We have child poverty, malnutrition. Prof. Jomo spoke and write a lot about this. Our kids are not growing. Compared to Singaporeans, we are 5 inch shorter. Against Korean, 10 inch shorter. We were the same. We laugh about this. Short, we cannot hate lah. We cannot win World Cup. But what's the impact? Cognitive development. We're not going to be smart, which means we not do well. Which means in school we not do well, we're not going to get good jobs, our income will be low, and most of the time it transfers to the kids because of the environment. And this nothing have to do with medical. Every kids around the world, by the age of 5, they have same ability to grow tall. Anyway, Africa, Latin America, doesn't matter, can 5. But we don't invest. Our kids getting, and in fact getting shorter. Level of stunting about getting higher, global have becoming lower. So we are not doing well. Yet the country has developed. We are getting poorer and the kids not doing very well. The second whammy, and people who do not well not going to buy your stuff. Poor people do not buy. The second whammy is that the gap between rich and poor getting wider. This is not due to COVID. Before COVID, it's already widened. Our response to COVID make it worse. EPF is an example. No other country in the world allow EPF withdrawal. Basically, to survive COVID, you self-finance. 145 billion from EPF, another 100 odd billion from loan moratorium. The government did not spend a lot. And I wrote an article, I said the government don't be kedekut, don't be stingy. They were stingy and we see the effect. The gap getting wider. The share, especially among the Chinese, it has increased. And the gap in asset also widening, not just in household income, but also in asset. Why is this happening? Why is it important? Our policy contribute to this. Our tax system is very regressive. You rich, you pay less. In fact, if you're rich, you don't pay. I love you a lot. That's why I don't charge you. I'll give a simple example. Car. If you loaded guy, you want to be stylo a bit, you buy EV car. What's the road tax and sales tax on EV car? 0. Porsche EV, Mercedes EV, 400,000, 600,000, 0. You makcik Kia, you buy Myvi. Do you pay tax? Yes. Sales tax, yes. Road tax, yes. It's not fair. Other countries also encourage EV. They put a cap. How much tax deduction you get? Ours, we give 100%. If you earn, as a worker, 100,000, you earn per year 100,000, you pay tax. If you buy and sell stocks, you get capital dividend. What's the tax you pay? 0. During COVID, glove company make a lot of money. The owner collect 2 billion in dividend. Not because he's smart, because everybody was sick. The dividend that he got from that, the tax that he paid on from that 2 billion, 0. Makcik Kiah pay tax. Now we want to introduce GST. GST is okay if you also impose other tax, which is fair. You cannot penalize Makcik Kiah alone. So our tax system is very regressive. At the same time, it's regressive. The rich do not pay a lot, do not pay their share, but they get the most. Spending is also regressive. Today, newspaper, they said if oil price increase, 100 billion will be spent on subsidies. Who get these subsidies? Last year, about 76 billion. This group. T20 get more in fuel subsidy than B40. Of course, your car is bigger. B40 either motorcycle or MyV or no motorcycle, no car. You get the most. Revenue is regressive. Spending is regressive. No surprise, poverty is high, inequality is widening. And the target of top 30, midterm review to be top 30 in the world, high income. Najib said this, high income. What you want is inclusive growth, like the president of the association said this morning. Upward mobility, social mobility, that's what you want. Everybody move up. Is this happening? I can say, yes, it happened before. Kwame has mentioned how we cut into poverty rate, share increase, number of professionals also increase before. There's upward mobility. We did a study when we Khazanah with Prof. Jomo, we did a study and we saw mobility improve. Those who were born in 1970s or 60s. We did a recent study with the World Bank. It was conducted this month, this year. We wanted to know if you are poor, where do you think your children will end up? This is important because this gives confidence. Either I'm going to invest on the children, I'm going to invest in this country or not. If you're poor, the B20 we take. Where, if you're poor, if you're B20 now, where do you think your child will end up? How many you think would make all the way to the top? 1%. Majority of the poor think the kid will remain poor or just move one ladder up. 1% can move, they think can move all the way up. This was not in 1960s or 70s. We asked the rich, if you're rich, where do you think, since you're rich, where do you think your children will end up? They stay rich or maybe they just move one ladder up. They do not have confidence. I mean, the poor do not have confidence the kids can move up. We asked another question. If there are 100 kids, poor kids, 100 poor kids, how many will grow up still poor? Average, they say, 50% will still poor. This is not good. Why is this happening? What do we need to do? Few things we need to do. Very simple. Follow what Jomo and Gomez says. Tax must be fair. I'm not saying tax should punish the rich. No, it should be fair. All sources of earnings might be taxed fairly. This should be one of your resolution. Number 2, spending must be progressive towards investment, school, public health, which is very important. What you shouldn't do, build schools separately for the poor. You heard this last month. It was in Parliament. Build schools separately for the poor. is idiotic. That we should not do. But among all, the main thing, you need confidence from the household, from businesses, from either foreign investment or from domestic investment. Confidence in what? There's no corruption. They respect rule of law. This DNAA is not confidence boosting. And what? And the command from civil society, including from this society, is silence. You said, and I want to quote, what do you say? Advocate of civil society, not pandering to the powerful. You said the dawn of political reforms. I would not choose the word dawn. I would choose the word sunset of political reforms. This is the most important thing. You can have progressive policy, progressive spending, but if the country is run by corrupt people, we would not do well. It would not just affect this generation, but future generation. Remember this, a Malaysian kid who entered Darjah 1 this year, 7 years old, by the time he works, year number 1, he works, he has to pay tax to pay for 1 MDB debt. Because the last debt settled in 2039. It affects him who is not even responsible for this. So my third plea to you, raise concern about rule of law, disrespecting rule of law. It is very important. Economy will only be inclusive if governance is adhered to and rule of law is respected.
Doctor, you may have
Otherwise,
to
I would end.
sum up. Yeah.
Otherwise, we would not do well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad Khalid. So I would like to invite all the speakers on stage, and we will start our question and answer sections. So let's show on stage on all the questions using the website. They are all together about 8 questions. Dr. Jomo, Dr. Muhammad Khalid. And looking at the questions, facilitator, I think the first question I'm going to ask is about, I would like to be more specific. The keynote speaker, Dr. Wu, mentioned about SMB, means small and medium banks, which I think Dr. Gomex also talked about it. So to what extent that, to a larger extent, will this revival of SMB will help our SMB, and what kind of things that we should pay attention to these SMBs?
Thank you very much. I personally did not see why there was the need for bank consolidation at the beginning of this century. And the choice from about 125 banks, if we include finance companies, we suddenly went down to the initial proposal was 6, and then eventually compromised at about 10. If you look, for example, at the United States, you find that the banking system, there are about 18,000 banks in the country today, and they serve very, very different functions. So by reducing the banks in terms of size, dealt with one particular concern, which was the whole question of consolidation in the light of the Asian financial crisis. But I think that it was not a wise move. But how do you reverse that situation now? I'm not sure there's any easy answer, because many of the problems of banking in this country are not going to be simply resolved by having a proliferation of smaller sized banks. I think that there is a need for us to really think very seriously about the role of banking intermediation. Right now, there's a very strong tendency for banks to make safe investments. The lending is usually highly collateralized. But if you're trying to support banks, if you're trying to support, let us say, smaller enterprises, you're trying to support much more dynamic medium-sized enterprises and smaller-sized enterprises. It's not clear to me that this will necessarily happen. There is a tendency now, for example, for public bank more than most other banks to fill that gap. But I don't think it fills the gap very well. But I think there needs to be very careful consultation with the needs of the industrial community, particularly, more than anything else, in terms of identifying the needs of the banking needs in order we have a banking reform. But unfortunately, right now, we don't find that there is any serious discussion of the role of money and banking in the country. I think the last time there was any serious discussion of this was during the 1970s. So it's a very unfortunate situation. Yeah.
I actually don't have much to add on this except to say this. Look at the history of the SME Bank. This goes back to the 9th Malaysia Plan, Abdullah's time. When Abdullah came in, he had some very interesting proposals in terms of targeting. He moved away from Mahathir's focus on big business to SMEs, correctly so. And he focused a lot of attention on the agriculture sector, including bringing technology and new ways of increasing productivity in the agro industry. But to finance it, he also merged 2 development financial institutions to make SME Bank. All in the right direction. My concern here is, again, and in fact he said it, and in the 12th Malaysia Plan review they stress it, the public delivery system. Does it reach the targeted group? The second is also we have to talk about this idea of targeted versus universal. How much targeting is there also which is ethnically defined when these rents are given out? I want to say one more thing. With the bank consolidation exercise, and in spite of the role of the DFIs, if they are, the fact of the matter is, from my discussions with members of the Chinese SME sector, they are very fearful of dealing with the banks, specifically the GLC type banks or any government type institution, because they fear if they give out that information can be used against them to expropriate their assets. This speaks to the issue of trust, confidence in the government, that the government will not use the institutions which are set up to help them to get the information that they will get will not be used against the SMEs. So these are a lot of the other issues we need to look at and consider very carefully, because it speaks to the issue of also what Khalid was talking about, confidence and trust in the government. And that way, the institutions which have been set up to help the SMEs will inspire the trust, and the SMEs themselves will come forward.
Thank you, Dr. Gomex. And while listening to the answer and comments from the speakers on stage, in fact, you can also post your comment or questions to make this section more interactive. But so far, I don't see any more questions on the small and medium banks. So I'll move on to the other question, and I'll try to integrate few questions. Okay, one of the questions that is stated that currently the world is divided into two major camps, the US and China.
So if one must choose a side, from your experience, which side do you believe will be most advantageous for Malaysia? And also the other question talk about Chinese investment in Malaysia and the chance of US-China full-scale military conflict remains high. So again, you're asking in the event of military conflict between both, what should be the immediate and the middle term measurement taken by Malaysia? I think this question is more suitable for Dr. Jomo first.
Thank you. I'll be very brief on the first question, which is, my view is that we should be non-aligned. We shouldn't take sides. We do not benefit by taking sides, and more importantly, we need to be pacifist, in the sense of warning against the dangers of war, and take a consistent position in that regard. It's not good enough just to say that you don't want to be aligned, and then you have all kinds of policies where you allow all kinds of breaches of it by others, and this, I think, is dangerous. We now have a situation where we are surrounded. It's not just the US and China. There's also the rising power of India, India, of course, is being courted very strongly by the US, but at the same time, it is playing a rather a more independent role to some extent. But it's a dangerous role. And of course, we are affected by policies within. People are very aware of what is happening in India, and you have not only a Hindu chauvinist government, but you also have a government which is growing very fast. Okay, the economy is growing very fast, but it is not growing in a way where you have a strong industrial class in India. This is, I think, very important. Ambani is not an industrialist. Okay. Now, if you look at China right now, and this is where I may have some slight disagreement. China right now is, of course, it claims to be an economy with socialism with Chinese characteristics. That's the official view. But if you look at what has been happening in the last 30, 40 years, what you see is a growing role of the private capitalist sector. Okay? We don't talk about it very much, but the private capitalist sector is very, very significant in China. Now, of course, as far as the Americans are concerned, everybody is controlled by the Communist Party. Okay? But I think one has to see that it is actually a very interesting and dynamic situation which is happening in China, where you have, on many occasions, the government, central government, having a view which is very different from what the big private capitalists want. Now, all the big private capitalists are members of the Communist Party, but it doesn't mean that they run the Communist Party. So they are, for example, if you look at what happened with Jack Ma and some of the other big tech giants, when they started trying to exert their own muscles and make their own deals, they came into conflict with the party came into conflict with them. So it's not simple, straightforward. But if you look at the trend in terms of the relative size of the economy, the trend is towards increasing private capital. Okay, and even during the 1980s and 1990s, the township and village enterprises were quite important. Now, township village enterprises are not growing very much compared to the other kinds of enterprises. So it is really private capital which is very dynamic, and the role of government-controlled companies is very important and very strategic. I think Professor Gomez is quite correct about this. But at the same time, if you think, for example, about ECRL, the financing of ECRL is completely, in my view, corrupt. Okay, it was corrupt. I happen to have been a former pre-engineering student. Okay, Okay, and most of my classmates in school later became engineers. And when I talked to them, when I first came back in 2016, I was I asked many of them how much the ECRL would cost. The estimate 17, 18 billion, okay? And that included the tunnel through the main range. Now, once you take the tunnel out, it costs even less. But if you look at what the current deal was made just before the 2018 election, the deal was for 81 billion, a costing of 81 billion, okay? Now, you do the arithmetic, okay? 1781. So you can see the huge margin, and everybody knows that this huge margin was to fund the last election, okay? It was to fund and to cover up the losses in 1MDB, okay? Everybody knows this. So, so that's why I took a very strong view opposing the ECRL. But as you all know, the ECRL has continued. It was modified a little bit, and in important ways. So the point I'm trying to make is that we have to have a much more nuanced view about China. It's not. If you take the American view, it's all controlled by the Communist Party. Everybody is a member of the Communist Party, etc., etc. China is much, much more complicated. What do you expect? 1.3, 1.4 billion people? It's definitely very complicated. But the trend is definitely towards growing capitalism. And of course, people don't like Xi Jinping because he has been trying to discipline the business community as well. So you find, if you read the American propaganda, for example, a lot of anti-Xi Jinping commentary. Okay, so I think it's a very, very complicated situation. Now, the second part of your question was on
military.
Sorry. Yeah, on China's investments in Malaysia, I already said something about but I think one has to be very clear about the different types of investments. So one of the, let me focus, just mention two, because I think we can get a much better deal with the relationship with Geely. Geely is going to have a lot of problems getting into the West. There is no reason why Proton, working with Geely, cannot become the main outlet for right-hand drive, is it? Right-hand drive cars throughout the world. Okay? So Proton becomes the new name for Geely, okay, for the world. I mean, Geely will find this very... Look at the problems Geely is having with Volvo, Geely is having a lot of problems with Volvo, but Volvo is doing better outside the world, outside China than is doing outside of China compared with Geely itself. So I think it is a win-win situation where Proton can become very, very significant, but it has to have a different type of management which thinks seriously about this. So I've already mentioned the case of ECRL. There are other cases as well, which I think are hugely problematic. If you look at all the rare earth extraction which is happening, this is a very dangerous thing. Okay, people have known in Malaysia about this since the 1980s at least. Some of you will remember Papan. Okay, Papan and all the fight over Papan and the rare earth. Rare earth mining has improved slightly in terms of techniques, but safety, it has not improved. So we need to have a much more careful strategy rather than a strategy created by the chief minister of one state who thinks he knows everything. He says, oh, we no need to do any more rice farming. We'll all go and dig out rare earth and that's good enough for the future of Kedah. and so on and so forth. You know, we need to have a much more considered strategy. So I think the issues involved are very, very varied and quite complex, and we need to take a serious view about this. But we also need to ensure that the national interests are protected, and that you do not have a relationship, you know, which becomes abusive. So much so that I still remember about 15 years ago, the Chinese ambassador in Tanzania had to make it very clear, you know, that China is China, Chinese government is Chinese government, but you cannot, the Chinese government cannot be responsible for the behavior of individual Chinese capitalists. And this, I think, is a very important distinction to be made. This was made in Africa because of the resentment which was being created. So I think we need to think about those kinds of concerns rather than the kind of propaganda right now about so-called debt diplomacy, Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, and so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you, Jomo.
I'd like to speak on the issue of China's investments in Malaysia. Let's not homogenize the investments like it's all of one sort. You need to take a sectoral perspective. In fact, we published a book a couple of years ago on China in Malaysia, but here we focused on the industrial sector. And the findings from our research on China's investments in Malaysia in the industrial sector were very different from the findings for when it comes to China's investments in infrastructure, ECRL, Malacca Gateway. So the type of project that we are looking at, the type of investments, which sector we're looking at, pay close attention to it. The stories are different depending on the sector you look at. The second point, the type of company from China investing in Malaysia. When we looked at the industrial sector, there were a lot of privately owned firms that were coming in, creating joint ventures too. When we looked at the infrastructure sector, it was run by state-owned enterprises, ECRL, Malacca Gateway, and joint ventures between SOEs and major GLCs, state-state, public-public partnerships. And in this sector, when we have public-public partnerships, we have a lot of secrecy. The cost gets inflated. The key actors involved in the negotiations are very different. But it can be good if the key actors are responsible and look out for the interests of the nation and use the state-owned enterprises and the GLCs working in a manner in which also supports domestic enterprises too. It didn't happen that way. It can happen this way. And I'm saying this because over the past few months, Anwar has already gone to China twice to look for investments which are going to come in. I'm also saying this because look at Malacca Gateway. We just talked about ECRL. Let's talk about Malacca Gateway. The environmental damage done by Malacca Gateway in that city is stupendous. Just visit the site. It was suspended. And just the other week, the Minister of Transport, who will be coming to speak today, so please post it. Yes, this is an important question. It's our environment. Under sea level, destroying the sea level, the fisheries sector. Under what conditions was this project approved? Who are the beneficiaries from this project? I want to put this on the table because, as I said, go sector by sector. The damage I see happening is in infrastructure, not in industrial. There's another sector, since we are here today and we are talking about it. Tan Yu Sing is here. Education. Education. China is coming into our education system, our private education system in a big way. They've set up Sherman University. What happens when China enters our education system too? What is the nature of their involvement? What is the kind of curriculum that they are offering? Are we talking about these things? And I hear that China is going to invest in a lot of new universities which are going to be set up in Malaysia. I may be wrong, but these are the things we're picking up through the grapevine. Is this another form of investment that's coming in? So this is an important question. China's investments in Malaysia, we have to go sector by sector and see the consequence of this. I want to close on one point. China's investments in infrastructure, specifically speaking to the issue of dams. If you look at Cambodia, if you look at the Mekong River, and if you look at the number of dams that were built there, and the massive destruction it had on farmers and the fishery sector, there's going to be a lot of investments on the building of dams in Malaysia. They're already in the pipeline projects in Sarawak, major dams, mini dams in Sabah, and let's not forget, there are also going to be mini dams in Perak. What are the implications of, who's going to build them? That's the first question. Second, what's the implications of these dams? I know green energy and all these things, we've got to debate it. But what I'm saying is, and I want to close on this point, when you bring in these investments, there needs to be a lot of vetting, a lot of discussions to ensure it does no harm to the environment or to domestic sectors too.
Okay. Dr. Muhammad.
Yeah. I'll try to answer about 3 questions. I'll try to keep it short. Number 1 on Along Bank, the recommendation on Along Bank. When there's an issue, our habit is to create another agency. We shouldn't. Because we have banks, we have money lending agencies. There's 3,100 money lending companies given license by Ministry of Housing. Banks is tightly regulated by Central Bank. If Central Bank say to Afin, jump, Afin will ask, how high? You control or support SME through directive, through policies, not by creating another institution, which is also going to be a problem later on. And we also have not just money lending companies, but we have now digital money lending. Shopee can loan you up to 120,000. Interest rate is very high, I think 18%, but I give you tomorrow. So there are already avenues. And of course, while the process might be low, but this is the role of Bank Negara that we should use, number 1. And Malaysia already, if household debt is already high, it's going to get higher. Number 2, there's a question on social protection. I want to answer this. We must have a social protection that covers everyone and holistic. Which now, in terms of labor, for instance, Singapore, about 99% of workers in Singapore are protected, contributed and protected. In Malaysia, only 60% contributed. Because if you are in informal sector, it's not compulsory. The government encourage. This is wrong. Every worker, regardless of either informal sector, makcik kia or you, or business owner, citizen or non-citizen, must contribute. Is very important. Social protection. And the social protection must follow life cycle from birth, the first 2 years, so we're not short, unemployment insurance, and when they retire. How do we increase? One question, how do we increase? We cannot increase. Only 2 ways. You increase contribution rate, which many Malaysians cannot afford, or you increase wages, which you guys oppose. This problem should not create this, the first place. The former Minister of Finance, Zafrul Miti, I wouldn't say it. He should be punished for this silly decision. He made a lot of people poor. So social protection must be holistic, and it should be like a bouncing net, like in circus. It's not captured, but it bounces back. And one resolution is media is here, and one resolution that you should put in your memorandum: no more pension for MPs or ministers. It should be EPF. They serve 4 or 5 years, they got pension for life. Nope. Every single of them, MPs, aduns, or minister, should be on EPF. So they're in the same boat as us.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. So I will ask the last question due to the time limitation. So we are not able to answer all the questions. So for the information of the 3 doctors on the stage, that today we have about 200 packs of participants. So about 25% of them are from the NGOs, civil societies. The other 25% from the scholars, academic, and opinion leaders. Then the majority, about 50%, are from our member association, the influential leaders in representing different layer of Chinese community. So if you have only one suggestion or one recommendation to all of them as a concerted effort in terms of economic team, what would be your recommendation and suggestion to them as either as an individual or as a Chinese community that is action oriented? Because we have second round of this roundtable discussion after today's conference. So that will be very important. Of course, we know there are many suggestions and recommendations, but I want to hear only the one and the only one, the most important thing that, to your opinion, that you can recommend to us. So let us maybe start with Dr. Muhammad.
I will repeat what I said, and this aligns with the objective and aspiration of the Chinese Assembly Hall. Not pandering to the powerful. I think that should be constant. And I'm shocked that the association, not just Chinese association, Malaysia and Indian also the same, when there's a red line has been crossed, DNAA, no separation of power, everybody is quiet.
No, we are not quiet.
Yes, and I hope later you will be louder, because this is important. The fate of the children, the 50% that stay poor, it should not be 50%. It depends on us. If we keep speaking out, we keep raising constructively, sometimes people think when we raise our voice, we are opposition. It's not true. We're in the same one, we want everybody to do better, and that's our responsibility. I think this is what we should keep doing.
Okay, thank you. We are not quiet. In fact, immediately after the Zahid case, we come up with a statement. Okay, next, Dr. Gomez.
I like this, just one recommendation. You called me here today to speak on the GLC ecosystem. If you look at the GLC ecosystem, it speaks to what's in the 12th Malaysia Plan. First, public governance, curb wastage, transparency and accountability, the right kind of legislation. You just clean up the GLC ecosystem, bring it out into the light, you can achieve all these goals. You can achieve the goal of using the state in a progressive manner. You can stop the wastage. You can stop the directorial appointments, and you will curb grand corruption. If you look at the past 40 years, since 1980 when Mahathir came to power, till 2022, the number of corruption cases, grand corruption cases, there have been, we've tabulated it already, we'll come out with a study on this soon, about 100 involving GLCs alone. 1MDB, LTAT, Bosted, Affin. LTAT is on the verge of collapse. What is the root of it? The GLC ecosystem. Why won't the government just come forth and deal with this, put it out in the open, if they are sincere about stopping corruption and improving the public governance system? So I have only one call. Deal with this GLC ecosystem in a fair, open, transparent manner, clean it up, and we will solve a lot of the problems that we've been talking about in the 12th Malaysia Plan.
I find it very difficult to answer your question, Mr. Yeo, because I think the biggest problem we have in this country is the promotion of ethnic thinking. Everything is seen through ethnic lenses. Any problem, you think about it, oh, Chinese or non-Chinese, that kind of thing. So this is a very major problem. So how do you think about the problems of this country which allow us to move beyond that kind of thinking? That is not an easy thing for me to say. And that's not for me to say, it's for you all to decide. I think we have a very difficult situation in the country now where we don't have a very strong government. And this government is being attacked in ways which are clearly part of what I would call ethno-populism. Okay? So what we have seen in this country, especially after World War II, is the promotion of ethno-populism, of thinking in terms of your ethnic community or religious community, against a much more progressive nationalism. So, for example, in 1947, there was an attempt led by recently Lim Kian Chai passed away. Okay, when he was the Secretary General of the Malayan Democratic Union, which was crucial to the All Malayan Council of Joint Action, which worked together with Putra, which was led by the late Dr. Burhanuddin, to propose a Perlembagaan Rakyat. There were all kinds of compromises which some of you may disagree with. But it's very important that we have never really had a strong sense of nationalism in this country, which is progressive. What we have is ethno-populism calling itself nationalism. So when a Malay calls himself nationalist, this is what he means. When a Chinese person calls him nationalist, this is what they mean, and so on and so forth. And this is something which we need to work towards overcoming. So I don't have any simple answer, but one of the important things I think is to make sure that the Chinese Assembly Hall particularly recognizes that it is more than just the interest of business. So you have the Chinese Chamber of Commerce, which is important, but there's also the Chinese Assembly Hall, which should be transcending this. And so many of the concerns which were raised earlier about accountability and so on, but also about the plight of the not so well-to-do. All these kinds of issues need to be addressed much more. And this is very unfortunate, because what we have seen in recent years is that, look at the average age around you. How many young people are taking a keen interest in what is happening today? This is a big problem, So who has more influence today? Bubble tea or the Chinese Assembly Hall? I'm serious, You look at the generational problems. Young people now, you have problems of obesity, of type 2 diabetes among young people, which you never had in the previous generation. So unless the leadership of the community recognizes the Chinese community has changed and rises to the contemporary problems, I think it'll be very difficult to move forward. I'm sorry not to give you a good answer.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jomo. And I think I will end today's section, and maybe we have to continue over the lunch. I think everybody are hungry now, and I pass the mic back to the MC of the day, Ms. Lim.